You pull out your phone, tap a screen a couple of times, and instantly, money vanishes from your bank account and appears in the hands of a family member thousands of miles away. It takes less than 3 seconds. We treat this insane level of convenience as a defining privilege of the 21st century. A modern miracle built on the back of the internet and billion-dollar fintech startups. But here is the thing that almost nobody realizes. The core architectural framework of that instant wire transfer wasn't invented in the 2000s or even the 1990s. It was actually invented in 1871. Western Union executed the very first commercial telegraphic money transfer over 150 years ago. So, the real question is, before that specific moment in 1871, before electricity connected the country, how on earth did you actually send money to your family? If you were working in a factory in New York and your brother was out mining gold in California, you couldn't send an email, you couldn't swipe a card, and you couldn't write a national check. You had to rely on a chaotic mess of unregulated IOUs, heavy wooden lock boxes, and men armed with literal shotguns who were fully prepared to kill or be killed to protect your cash. This is the story of how America moved its wealth before the spark of electricity changed the world forever. To truly understand the sheer logistical nightmare of moving wealth before the late 19th century, you have to completely erase your modern understanding of money. Today, you think of a United States dollar as a universal constant. A $20 bill in Maine spends exactly the same as a $20 bill in Texas. But in the decades leading up to the American Civil War, the concept of a unified federal currency simply did not exist. The United States was operating under a system that historians often refer to as the wildcat banking era. It was a period of unrestrained, chaotic free market capitalism where anyone with a printing press and a state charter could effectively open a bank and start issuing their own paper money. By the 1850s, there were over 8,000 different types of paper currency circulating throughout the country. Imagine walking into a general store in 1855. You want to buy a sack of flour, and you hand the merchant a $5 note issued by the Farmers and Mechanics Bank of Michigan. The merchant wouldn't just put it in the register, he would pull out a thick, encyclopedic magazine called a banknote reporter. These publications were updated weekly, and merchants had to subscribe to them just to survive. The merchant would flip through thousands of pages to check 3 things. First, does this bank actually exist? Or is it a wildcat bank that set up shop in the middle of nowhere just to print worthless paper? Second, did this bank go bankrupt yesterday? And third, is this note a counterfeit? At one point prior to 1860, it was estimated that roughly 1/3 of all circulating paper money in the United States was completely fake. And even if your bill was genuine, its value was dictated entirely by geography. That $5 Michigan note might only be worth $4 in Ohio, $3 in Pennsylvania, and practically nothing by the time you reached New York. Distance destroyed value. Because paper money was so incredibly unreliable, if you wanted to send real, undeniable wealth to someone in another city, you couldn't rely on paper. You had to send hard money, gold and silver coins. But hard money has a massive physical flaw. It is incredibly heavy, and it takes up space. If you owed a debt of $1,000 to a merchant 3 states away, you couldn't just mail a piece of paper. You had to physically transport a heavy sack of gold across the country. And in an era where the primary modes of transportation were horses, riverboats, and your own 2 feet, moving physical weight meant moving slowly. It meant your wealth was exposed to the elements, to shipwrecks, to corrupt couriers, and, most notoriously, to highwaymen. The American landscape was vast, largely unpoliced, and filled with desperate people. Sending money wasn't a financial transaction. It was a high-stakes logistical operation that required armed guards. The entire American economy was effectively bottlenecked by the speed of a galloping horse and the physical strength required to haul heavy metals over dirt roads. You were trapped in a paradox. You could try to send a piece of paper, which was lightweight but might be rendered completely worthless by the time it reached its destination due to fluctuating exchange rates and banking panics. Or you could send physical gold, which held its value perfectly, but was incredibly dangerous and expensive to move. There was no middle ground. There was no way to separate the value of the money from the physical object representing that money. The system was held together by localized trust, heavy iron safes, and a tremendous amount of localized friction. It was a fragmented, hyper-local economy that desperately wanted to expand westward, but was shackled by its inability to move its own capital. This chaotic reality was manageable when most Americans lived their entire lives within a 20-mile radius of where they were born. But two massive, earth-shattering events were about to completely rip the country open, scattering families across thousands of miles and turning this localized financial friction into an absolute, unmitigated crisis. The first great fracture in this localized system happened in 1848, with the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill in California. Practically overnight, the California gold rush triggered one of the largest mass migrations in human history. Suddenly, you had hundreds of thousands of young men leaving their families on the East Coast and traveling 3,000 miles west to strike it rich. And this created a terrifying geographic imbalance of wealth. The young men digging the gold out of the ground in California needed to send it back to their wives, aging parents, and creditors in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. But there were no banks that spanned the continent. There was no telegraph wire connecting the coasts. There wasn't even a transcontinental railroad yet. The only way to move that newly dug wealth across the continent was through private express companies. This was the era that gave birth to legendary firms like Adams Express and, most famously, Wells Fargo, founded in 1852. These companies built massive logistics networks reliant on stagecoaches, and it was exactly as gritty and dangerous as the movies make it look. A standard Wells Fargo Concord stagecoach was a massive piece of machinery, weighing around 2,500 pounds empty, costing over $1,000 to build, and pulled by teams of 4 to 6 horses. But the most important part of that stagecoach was a heavy green wooden box, reinforced with iron, bolted to the floorboard directly beneath the driver's feet. That was the treasure box. Inside was raw gold, printed currency, and sensitive mail. This is where we get a phrase you probably use every week. Because driving a stagecoach filled with thousands of dollars in gold through isolated canyons and unpoliced territories was essentially a suicide mission, the driver could not work alone. He was entirely focused on managing 6 massive horses. So, the express companies hired a second man to sit directly next to the driver. His entire job description was to hold a short-barreled shotgun and stare into the tree line, ready to blow away anyone who tried to stop the carriage. This is the literal historical origin of riding shotgun. It wasn't a fun claim for the front seat of a car. It was a deadly, high-stress occupation required just to move capital from point A to point B. And the threat was very real. Outlaws like the infamous Black Bart made entire careers out of ambushing these specific stagecoaches. Bart alone successfully robbed 28 Wells Fargo coaches in the 1870s and 80s, notoriously leaving polite, taunting poetry inside the empty treasure boxes after taking the gold. Sending money meant gambling your life savings against the criminal underworld. But, as bad as the gold rush logistics were, The situation exploded into a catastrophic national emergency a decade later. In 1861, the American Civil War erupted. This wasn't just a few thousand prospectors moving west. This was the mass mobilization of millions of young men from every farm, village, and city in the country. Men were pulled from their civilian lives and thrust into brutal combat across the divided nation. And while they were fighting, dying, and bleeding, they were also getting paid. The Union Army was distributing millions of dollars in paychecks to soldiers in the field. But those soldiers were standing in muddy encampments in Virginia or Tennessee, while their wives and children were back in Ohio or Massachusetts, rapidly running out of food and facing eviction. The soldiers had to get their wages back home, and they had to do it immediately. But they didn't have access to Wells Fargo stagecoaches, and they certainly couldn't hire armed guards. The only infrastructure available to the average infantryman was the standard, regular United States mail. So, out of sheer desperation, hundreds of thousands of soldiers simply took their paper greenbacks, folded them up, shoved them into standard paper envelopes, licked the seal, and handed them to the military postal clerks. They were sending millions of dollars of raw, unprotected cash through an overtaxed, chaotic wartime postal system. It was a recipe for an absolute disaster, and the results were devastating. When you inject millions of dollars of untraceable cash into an unregulated paper pipeline, human nature takes over. Almost immediately, the U.S. postal system experienced an epidemic of mail theft on a scale that is difficult to comprehend today. The system was completely porous. Envelopes were handled by dozens of different people: military clerks, railroad workers, local postmasters, and delivery boys, before they ever reached their final destination. Any one of those individuals could simply hold an envelope up to the light, see the silhouette of a banknote inside, tear it open, pocket the cash, and throw the letter in a ditch. And that is exactly what happened. Tens of thousands of letters never arrived. Soldiers would bleed on the battlefield for a month, earn $13, mail it home, and receive a heartbreaking letter weeks later from their starving wives saying the money never showed up. It was a crisis that was literally destroying the morale of the Union Army. Soldiers were threatening to desert simply so they could go home and feed their families. The federal government tried to implement a system of registered mail, which basically just meant putting a wax seal on the envelope and having clerks sign a logbook when they handed off the sack of mail. But this was merely a temporary Band-Aid on a gaping wound. Registered mail didn't stop a determined thief. And worse, if a registered letter went missing, the government took zero financial responsibility for the lost cash. The tragedy of this failing system culminated in one of the most depressing bureaucratic departments in American history: the Dead Letter Office. This was a centralized facility in Washington, D.C., where undeliverable mail was sent. During the Civil War, the volume of dead letters skyrocketed. Clerks were tasked with opening these lost letters to try and figure out who they belonged to. Imagine the psychological toll of that job. Day after day, these clerks were opening envelopes stained with mud and blood, finding uncashed banknotes, and reading desperate final messages from young men who had been blown apart at Gettysburg or Antietam. Millions of dollars in cash were piling up in government vaults, completely orphaned, while families at home slipped into extreme poverty. The private sector couldn't solve this. Companies like Adams Express and Wells Fargo were incredibly efficient at moving massive shipments of gold between major banking hubs or out of specific mining towns, but their business model didn't scale to the micro level. It wasn't profitable for them to send an armed guard to a remote farm in Indiana just to deliver a $10 bill to a soldier's mother. The private express routes were arteries, but the country needed capillaries. It needed a way to reach every single rural outpost and village without incurring the massive overhead of physical security. The fundamental problem remained unsolved. As long as sending money meant sending a physical object of value, whether it was a gold coin or an untraceable bearer bond, it would always be a target for violence and theft. The system was fundamentally broken because it relied on the physical movement of the asset itself. To fix this, someone had to figure out how to destroy the physical link. Someone had to invent a way to turn money into pure information, rendering the physical envelope completely worthless to anyone but the intended recipient. The nation was desperate for a financial miracle. And, ironically, it wouldn't come from a brilliant Wall Street banker or a Silicon Valley tech visionary. It would come from a stubborn government bureaucrat. The man who ultimately revolutionized how Americans move money was Postmaster General Montgomery Blair. Blair was appointed by Abraham Lincoln, and he inherited a postal department that was hemorrhaging money and losing the trust of the American public. Blair was a pragmatic, fiercely determined administrator who saw the mass theft of soldiers' pay not just as a logistical failure, but as a profound moral outrage. He realized that the Postal Service was the only network in the country with the geographic reach necessary to connect the front lines to the rural home front. But to use that network securely, he had to completely redesign the architecture of a transaction. Blair looked across the Atlantic. Great Britain had actually established a rudimentary postal money order system back in 1839. Blair studied it, adapted it for the sprawling geography of the United States, and began aggressively lobbying Congress. In his annual reports of 1862 and 1863, he practically begged the federal government to establish a money order system. He argued that it was a matter of national security and moral duty to protect the soldiers. And finally, the urgency of the war broke through the political gridlock. On May 17, 1864, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Postal Money Order Act into law. The brilliance of the 1864 Postal Money Order was in its conceptual simplicity. It completely decoupled the value of money from the physical piece of paper being mailed. Here is exactly how it worked. Let's say a Union soldier in a camp in Virginia wanted to send $10 to his wife in Boston. Under the old system, he put a $10 bill in an envelope. If a thief stole the envelope, the thief got $10. But under Blair's new system, the soldier took his $10 in physical cash and handed it directly to a designated military postmaster. The postmaster took the cash, locked it in a secure local safe, and in exchange wrote out a specific receipt, a money order. This piece of paper had the soldier's name, the wife's name, and the specific post office in Boston where it was to be redeemed. The soldier then mailed this receipt home. Meanwhile, the postmaster in Virginia sent a separate, internal administrative ledger to the postmaster in Boston, alerting him that the transaction was coming. When the soldier's wife received the envelope, she took the money order to her local Boston post office. The clerk checked her identity, matched her money order against the internal ledger they had received, and if everything lined up, the clerk opened his own local safe and handed her $10 in cash. Do you see what Montgomery Blair actually did here? The money itself never moved. The gold or the greenbacks never traveled on a train, never rode on a stagecoach, and never sat in a vulnerable mail sack. The Virginia Post Office kept the cash in their vault, and the Boston Post Office paid out the cash from their own separate vault. The only thing that actually traveled across the country was a piece of paper carrying information. If a thief ambushed the mail train and stole the envelope, it didn't matter. The money order was completely useless to him because he didn't have the matching ID, and his name wasn't on the internal ledger. For a flat fee of just 10 cents for transfers up to $10, Blair had created an unstealable financial instrument. When the system launched in late 1864, it was restricted to just 141 select post offices, and Congress, nervous about the government acting like a bank, capped the maximum transfer limit at a mere $30. In fact, Representative Meyer Strauss of Pennsylvania openly complained on the House floor that a $30 limit was absurdly low, but the act passed anyway, just to get it off the ground. The impact was immediate and explosive. It was a massive, roaring success. Families were saved. The theft of soldiers' pay plummeted. By 1890, the United States Post Office was issuing over $110 million in money orders every single year. The U.S. government had inadvertently become the largest, most trusted retail banking network in the country. Montgomery Blair had successfully digitized money, not with computers, but with standardized ledgers and administrative communication. He had built the engine, but it was still constrained by one final physical limitation: the speed of the mail train. It still took weeks for that piece of information to cross the country. To truly conquer time and space, that ledger system needed to be electrified. The final barrier of speed was shattered exactly 7 years after Blair's Act was passed. The year was 1871, and the catalyst was the Western Union Telegraph Company. Western Union had spent the previous 2 decades aggressively stringing up telegraph wires across the continent. By 1871, they commanded a staggering network of over 112,000 miles of wire. They effectively monopolized instant communication in North America. And their executives realized something profound. They looked at Montgomery Blair's Postal Money Order system and realized that a money order is just a transfer of information. It's just a message from point A to point B saying deduct ledger here, credit ledger there. And if it's just a message, it doesn't need to be written on paper and put on a train. It can be tapped out in Morse code. In October 1871, Western Union launched the commercial wire transfer. It was a tectonic shift in human history. The process was remarkably similar to the postal system, just accelerated to the speed of light. You walked into a telegraph office in New York, handed the clerk cash, and paid a premium fee. The clerk tapped a secure, coded message over the telegraph wires to the office in San Francisco. Minutes later, your family member in California walked into their local office, verified their identity, and walked out with cash. The money hadn't moved. The data had. The 2 local offices simply settled their net debts with each other at a later date, usually through massive, secure bank transfers of gold. In a single stroke, Western Union became the dominant force in global money movement. The phrase wiring money entered the global lexicon, inextricably linking the brand of Western Union with financial lifelines for over a century. From 1871 onward, the fundamental problem of how to move wealth safely across a continent was solved. Money was no longer physical, it was electric. And this is where we have to stop and take a hard, critical look at the world we live in today. Fast forward to the 2020s. We are bombarded with marketing from multi-billion-dollar financial technology companies. Startups in Silicon Valley pitch sleek apps, decentralized blockchains, and revolutionary digital wallets, all promising to disrupt the legacy financial system. They sell us the illusion that we are operating on cutting-edge, 21st-century architecture. But if you strip away the neon branding, the biometric face scans, and the smooth user interfaces, you will find a deeply uncomfortable truth. The underlying architecture of the global financial system, the way money actually moves between different banks, different countries, and different currencies, has barely changed since 1871. Think about how the SWIFT network operates today, or how your bank processes a standard ACH transfer. It is a system of correspondent banks, separated by borders or institutions, sending secured messages to each other, instructing the receiving bank to credit an account, while the sending bank debits an account, followed by a delayed batch settlement process on the back end. When you use a modern mobile app to send money internationally, the fundamental logic of that transaction is mathematically and structurally identical to the telegraph operator tapping out Morse code in 1871. The core ledger system invented by Montgomery Blair and electrified by Western Union is still the beating heart of global finance. We have swapped out the telegraph key for fiber optic cables. We have replaced the Morse code operator with API endpoints and automated fraud detection algorithms. But the structural reliance on trusted centralized intermediaries, separate localized vaults, and the messaging and settlement paradigm remains entirely intact. We haven't actually disrupted the system, we have just optimized it. We are running a 150-year-old software program on faster hardware. This realization completely changes how we should view our modern financial supremacy. We love to look back at history with a sense of chronological snobbery. We laugh at the idea of putting a wooden box full of gold on a bumpy stagecoach. We shake our heads at the chaotic wildcat banks printing worthless paper, and we pity the Civil War soldiers who had to literally lick an envelope and pray that a thief wouldn't steal their wages. We believe that we have made a massive evolutionary leap forward. But have we really invented a new way to move value? Or have we simply built an invisible stagecoach? The fundamental necessity of trusting a third party, a gatekeeper, to guarantee that your labor in one city is recognized as valid in another city hasn't disappeared. The heavy wooden treasure box under the driver's feet didn't go away. It just transformed into encrypted server farms buried in the desert. The man riding shotgun, gripping a weapon to protect your wealth, is no longer wearing a cowboy hat. He takes the form of cybersecurity protocols and anti-money laundering algorithms, but the friction of trust remains. The architecture of 1871 still governs your smartphone. So, the next time you tap your screen to split a dinner bill or send money to a friend, ask yourself this: are you really living in the financial future? Or are you just tapping a digital telegraph key, moving invisible numbers on a ledger, doing exactly what your great-grandparents did, just 1,000,000 times faster? If this look into the hidden, rusty machinery running our modern financial world made you question the tech in your pocket, make sure to hit the subscribe button. On this channel, we don't just recount dusty history, we peel back the sleek, polished layers of the modern world to expose the 19th century bones hiding underneath. Drop a comment below and let me know. Do you actually trust your digital wallet more than you would trust a man riding shotgun with a lockbox? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next breakdown.